Welcome everybody to today's lecture. I'm very happy to see so many of you here in the audience. My name is Kai Marshall, and I will be moderating today's very first lecture. So, as many of you might know, the head of our recently established research center is Professor Lin Yuanze, and he unfortunately is undergoing a medical treatment today, so he asked me to replace him and say a few words on our center. I'm the co-director, one of 4 co-directors, so I will say a few words on our Center for Chinese Cultural Subjectivity in Taiwan, and then Professor Xu will introduce Professor Senft. We're very excited and honored to have Professor Senft here today. So let me begin with a few words on our center and the idea behind our center. So Chinese culture is not only the foundation of Chinese society, but also the communal asset of human beings. Studies of Chinese culture have thrived in various aspects through a long period of time. However, contemporary international studies of Chinese culture are mostly confined to traditional departments of Chinese studies, which focus their researches on literature, history, philosophy, religion, and others, and they consider Han culture as their center. Researches that cover the contemporary value of Chinese modernization and Chinese culture are largely included in the departments of political science and economy. And mostly these kind of researches are done in the East, belong to East Asian studies. So facing the increasing influence of Chinese politics, economy, military, art, established Western paradigms have also failed to discover Chinese cultural subjectivity in depth. Chinese humanities studies, on the other hand, are trapped in the predicament of Western academic colonization and are paving its way for cultural conservatism. Taiwan, with its special historical condition, has better preserved and transformed Chinese culture than mainland China. As a result, Taiwan has the privilege to take up the responsibility of rebuilding Chinese academic traditions and establishing a new paradigm of Chinese studies. This cross-disciplinary research center, our center, takes Sinophone as its starting point, and thus extends its academic fields to Sinophone regions. Consequently, its research interests cover mainland China, so what we call China internationally, Taiwan, Hong Kong, North America, Southeast Asia, and many other places around the globe. By doing so, the center is able to examine the multiplicity of Chinese cultures and its communal cultural subjectivity, which is being lived by people speaking Chinese, Sinophone people, and which has also led to its cultural recognition. In terms of cross-cultural typology, from the perspective of subjectivity, such methods of study can also avoid the exclusiveness of Han culture-centered discourse and generate the self-recognition of individual cultural subjectivity. So our center has just been established in this June, so we didn't have much time to prepare, but we have 3 important purposes. The first purpose is we want to lead the international cooperation between institutes of Chinese studies and establish a new paradigm of Chinese studies. Second, we want to cultivate international humanities scholars. Third, we want to provide scholars with a platform for dialogue and remodel Chinese action meaning system. And there are a lot of professors at our university are involved into this endeavor, more than 20 professors actually, and we have organized our center in 4 different subfields. So there's first the subfield of Sinophone modes of thinking, and where philosophers and scholars in religious studies work together to explore the Sinophone view of space and time, for example, and also to explore problems of cultural and conceptual difference. Second, there's a research group for Sinophone religiosity. So people here, or scholars, professors here are working, for example, on the Taiwanese society as a post-secular society, and scholars are also doing comparative research on the different traditions of world religions. So, for example, we are here at NCCU. We have the only department, Arabic department in Taiwan. So people are also working on Islam, for example. And then third, we have a research group on Sinophone ethical practices. So people in, for example, applied ethics are working here together with people who study Chinese medicine and all forms of therapy in Chinese culture. And fourth, we also have a research group on Sinophone digital humanities. So as you all might know, this is a very important international trend now to re-explore the heritage of traditional humanities by means of digital humanities, so by means of, for example, databases and nets, like cultural mapping and social networks. And images as an important, to reconsider or consider images as an important means of conceptual communication. So this is more or less what I want to say about our institute, and I'm very happy and very excited to have Professor Senft here. So let me now ask Professor Xu to briefly introduce Professor Senft, and then we will directly start with Professor Senft's lecture. Thank you very much. Yeah.
To me, we are very honored for our College of Foreign Languages and Literatures to collaborate with this new research center for Chinese cultural subjectivity in organizing this exciting lecture series on Chinese, on language and cultural subjectivity. As you can see here, Professor Gunter Senft is an affiliate researcher. He's just retired. And still he's affiliated with the Mexican Institute for Psycholinguistics, and he's an Auxiliary Professor for General Linguistics at the University of Cologne. Actually, we were in the same institute in 2009 when I visited Mexican Institute. I stayed with the Language and Gesture group, and Gunter was in the Department of Language and Cognition. And at that time, I noticed that a lot of researchers in his group studied less known languages in the world, and that's really exciting because for this important issue of cultural and linguistic diversity. Professor Senft is a specialist in Austronesian languages, especially Kanavila. And we know that this island is in Papua and New Guinea, and it's world famous for language and cultural diversity. At least 850 languages were recognized as different languages in the country, or 873. There's a lot. And also Professor Gunter just corrected me that it's not 18 books, 22 books he authored or co-edited. Is it the most recent one? Okay, growing up on the Gibraltar Islands, and 88 journal articles and 93 book chapters. So his interests, his research interests are very broad. And he's coming here, and in this lecture series, he will be sharing those of his past studies and findings and experiences in working with this less known or lesser known language. Maybe it's well known because of you. Today he will talk about conceptualization of space. So let's welcome Gunter. Thank you.
hear me, let me know, then I use the mic. Before I actually start my talk, I would first of all like to thank the Research Center for Chinese Culture and Subjectivity at the National Tianjin University in Taiwan, its director, Professor Dr. Lin Yuanzhe, and Professor Dr. Gawai, for inviting me to hold a lecture series on language and cultural subjectivity. I felt and feel very, very much honored by this invitation, and I'm glad to thank you very, very much for that. I also want to thank Lucy Wen Yung Huang and Professor Gawai for the excellent cooperation organizing my trip and my stay in Taipei. Thank you so much. Do you think it's necessary?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Today I would like to talk about conceptualization of space, frames of spatial reference. If you have any difficulties to understand me, or if I'm getting too fast in my speech, which sometimes happens, please take the break and say, stop, not too fast. But I try my very best. Okay, the central aim of the Language and Cognition Department of the Max Planck Institute for Psycholinguistics has been to further research into the relationship between language, culture and cognition by conducting fieldwork on issues of common interests to anthropology, psychology and linguistics. There are many important questions. There are many important questions about the nature and extent of universal human intellectual endowments in various domains for which there has been little reliable cross-cultural data so far. The goal of the department is to fill some of these gaps and to contribute to the development of more sophisticated theories about the relationship between learned and native abilities, about the contribution of culture to cognition, and about the nature and transmission of culture itself and its relation to social structure and process. The discussion of questions like these has a rather long tradition, of course, with Immanuel Kant, Johann Gottfried Herder, Wilhelm von Humboldt, Boas, Sapir and Worf as its most prominent protagonists. Edward Sapir, one of Boas' students, took up his professor's rather cautiously formulated idea that it may be well to discuss the relation between language and thought. It has been claimed that the conciseness and cleanness of thought of people depend to a great extent upon their language. That was what Boas said about the topic. Then Edward Sapir summarized his own ideas about the topic in the following relatively provocative statements, and these are all quotes now. Language is a guide to social reality. Though language is not ordinarily thought of as of essential interest to the students of social science, it powerfully conditions all our thinking around social problems and processes. Human beings do not live in the objective world alone, nor alone in the world of social activity as ordinarily understood, but are very much at the mercy of the particular language which has become the medium of expression for their society. It is quite an illusion to imagine that one adjusts to reality essentially without the use of language, and that language is merely an incidental means of solving specific problems of communication or reflection. The fact of the matter is that the real world is to a large extent unconsciously built up on the language habits of the group. No two languages are ever sufficiently similar to be considered as representing the same social reality. The worlds in which different societies live are distinct worlds, not merely the same world with different labels. So far, Edward Sapir. A few years later, he even speaks of the tyrannical hold that linguistic form has upon our orientation in the world. However, it was Edward Sapir's student Benjamin Lee Worf who finally came up with the formulation of the concept of linguistic relativity, namely in two papers that were published in 1940 and then were printed in 1956. There, Benjamin Lee Worf states the following: "We dissect nature along lines laid down by our native languages. The categories and types that we isolate from the world of phenomena we do not find there because they stare every observer in the face. On the contrary, the world is presented in a kaleidoscopic flux of impressions which has to be organized by our minds. And this means largely by the linguistic systems of our minds. This is the weak version of what he then referred to as the linguistic relativity principle. And this weak version claims that language influences thought. But Worf came also up with another version of this principle, the so-called strong version, which claims that language determines thought. These hypotheses have been discussed quite controversially. Many cognitive scientists have been fascinated by the challenge presented in the weaker version, which claims that language influences thought. Now, is there a way to empirically test this claim? With our interests in the interrelationship between language, culture, and cognition, this challenge was crucial for our research. We tried to answer the following leading research questions. First, do we find any differences in the semantic parameters that are basic to specific lexical domains in different languages? And if so, what are these differences? Are these differences dependent on cultural findings? And third, can we draw inferences from these lexical semantic differences between different languages as to differences in cognitive conceptualization, and more generally as to differences with respect to cognitive processes that are important for speakers of these languages? And we followed this strategy for answering these questions. First, we had to decide on a conceptual domain we wanted to research. In our case, this first domain was space. Second, we had to find two or more languages which contrast in the semantic treatment of that domain. That is, they were very different semantic parameters I employed. Third step was develop non-linguistic tasks which will behaviorally reveal the conceptual parameters utilized to solve them. And fourth, compare the linguistic and non-linguistic representation systems as revealed by the second and the third question, and assess whether there is any correlation between linguistic and non-linguistic codings in the same domain. The conceptual domain we picked first was space. And while we looked at space, we became more and more proud, and also certainly somewhat conceited, because we realized that we can falsify Immanuel Kant. And a German who can falsify Kant feels conceited. Because Immanuel Kant claimed that we only have three axes in order to represent an object in space, namely our right and left side, our front and our back, and our upside and our downside. However, Kant didn't know the ethnic group in Australia that lives close to Cooktown, the Yimidia. By the way, all of us who speak English have a word of Yimidia as a loan word. Because when James Cook had some problems with his mast during his second voyage, he realized that near to that place where we have now Cooktown, there were very nice and very high trees. So he had his crew get out and chop down some of these trees, and while they were chopping down the trees, they saw these strange creatures that were hopping through the bush. And he asked the people there, what is that animal? How do you call this animal? And this was a kangaroo. In these days we had more than 200 languages in Australia, and kangaroo was just the word the Yimidia used for this animal. There were many, many others in the Australian languages that are all moribund and have died now. Now, what was so special with the Yimidia? If you are a Yimidia, you would say, I have this microphone in my right hand. But if the microphone would be here on a stative, a Yimidia would say, and I'm certainly wrong now, the microphone is to the west of my hand. They differentiate the world according to a kind of compass-like system with north, south, east, and west. And they are really almost everywhere and always absolutely oriented. If you have questions to that, we can discuss them later. So we have one new system of spatial reference, and we should see whether we find other forms of these different ways of making spatial references in the human languages of the world, the natural languages of the world. So, our initial goal was to investigate the conceptualization of space and spatial reference in a cross-cultural and cross-linguistic perspective. Now, to do this, we had to develop methods to build a comparative database through parallel feature search in different languages and cultures. And this database should then serve us as a kind of natural laboratory for testing and revising theories in psychology and theoretical linguistics. To do this, we really used a very broad spectrum of elicitation techniques, and now I bring you into the field. You see there is a strange Gunter want to learn something about spatial expressions in your language, and he comes to you and asks for a volunteer to do the following thing. I first give you the standardized Tilivila translation of what we did in similar languages in all the languages we studied. We made this up at home so that we have had all the questions that we asked our consultants standardized. And in Tilivila, it was the following one. Puki esisu. Puki esisu, okay? Cookies. Manata puki, ikwanibu kukwanibu, ili toke kitakwadi, kahukwa, dikwakweko. Magigu yokwa kukisi pikisi kumveluna, kukisi kwe. Igao kulivala kukwanibu lubem, kenatao, kenavivi. Now I translate it. There is a book. Look, here it is. This book tells a story with a little boy, a dog, and a frog. I would like you to look at all the pictures and to look very carefully. Then you tell the story your friend, either a man or either a boy or a girl. Okay, now, who would like to do this? You can choose your language, whatever you like. It can be Chinese, it can be English, it can be German. But I just would like you to look at that book and to tell the story in the same way that we asked our consultants to do it. You will see that the result of this narration presents a lot of spatial references, and especially motion verbs and adpositions. Who wants to do it? When you ask for a volunteer, they all go one step back so that the others can easily step forward. Come on. A field researcher can only do his work or her work if he finds cooperative people.
You can do it in Chinese.
Great. Thank you very much. No. You just have to keep in mind the same feeling that you have now was a feeling that the people in Tawima had with me. But they realized that they wanted to have their language documented, and they realized also that it was an important research, because they were extremely proud that when I came back for my third field trip, I had my grammar with me and showed them the grammar and the dictionary. And they were so happy with that they did everything else what I afterwards asked them to do. So, please, shoot.
从前有一个小男孩，他有一只狗，和一只捡到的青蛙，他把青蛙放在瓶子里面，然后一天晚上他们两个，小男孩和小狗去睡觉，在他们睡觉的时候，青蛙偷偷的跑出来，青蛙偷偷的从瓶子里跑出来。隔天早上，小男孩和小狗起床的时候，很兴奋的想看瓶子，结果瓶子里已经没有青蛙了。他们东找西找，翻了衣服里面、鞋子里面、帽子里面，小狗还把头伸进瓶子里面，想看看青蛙是不是真的不见了。 他们还打开窗户朝外面喊：“青蛙，你在哪里？”结果一不小心，小狗因为头卡在玻璃瓶里面太重了，就从窗户上掉下去，把瓶子打破了。小男孩很生气的把小狗抱起来，然后安慰他，但是同时也骂他为什么那么不小心。他们决定去森林里面找看看有没有青蛙。他们大喊着：“青蛙，青蛙，你在哪里？”但是没有人回应。小狗看到树上有一个蜂窝，就很兴奋地跑过去，想要跟蜜蜂玩。它对着蜂窝大叫，然后蜜蜂全部都飞出来。小男孩看到地上有一个洞，对着洞里喊：“青蛙，你在里面吗？”小狗爬到树上，想要吃那个蜂窝，结果蜜蜂全部都很生气地飞出来。小男孩从洞里喊的时候，一只土拨鼠跑出来，咬了他的鼻子一下。小狗疯狂地摇着树，树上的蜂窝掉下来，全部的蜜蜂都冲出来，想要咬它。小男孩跑到隔壁的树上，看到树上有一个洞，从洞里喊：“青蛙，你在里面吗？”结果从树洞里飞出一只猫头鹰，把小男孩吓了一跳，掉到树下。小狗现在很忙，因为它忙着逃离蜜蜂的追赶。小男孩小男孩继续找，爬到一颗石头上，猫头鹰还是紧追不舍。小男孩爬到石头上，扶着旁边的树枝，想要站高一点，看看青蛙是不是在附近。他扶着一个树枝，结果树枝动了起来，他突然被抬起来。原来那个树枝是一只鹿，它被卡在鹿的头上。鹿因为看不见路，所以它一直跑，跑到一个悬崖边，突然停下来。小狗发现了，也跟着鹿还有小男孩一直跑。鹿停下来，把小男孩摔到悬崖底下，小狗也跟着掉下去。他们扑通一声掉进了池塘里面，还好池塘很浅。他们坐起来，发现隔壁传来熟悉的声音。小男孩叫小狗安静，然后爬到池塘旁边的树干，往树干后面一看，发现有2只青蛙，然后还有很多只小小的青蛙。有一只青蛙朝着他跳过来，他发现就是我原本的那只青蛙。然后青蛙说他只是想要出来玩，所以小男孩就把青蛙抱起来，跟着小狗回家了，还跟他的家人说拜拜，下次再来。
Thank you very much. So I assume I didn't promise you too much. There was a lot of spatial reference in it. These things were absolutely useful because we really could standardize our ways of data gathering. And you'll see that we did some other things. The next thing that we used, but which we gave up, was the path film by Jack Dubois and Wally Chafe. The path film has so many different cuts and so many perspectives that it really was a bit too much for people who were not used to see pictures and films. But we also came up with something that we developed on the basis of research that was done by Herb Clark. We developed so-called interactional games for focused linguistic and elicitation. And this was, the idea behind this is that you have 2 interactants. One director who selects something that he or she has to describe. There is a screen between the two, so those that they can't see the way of how these pictures, for example, or other things were organized. And then on the basis of the description of the director, the performer had to select the described subject or the described object. Actually, that showed me that you have to be extremely careful as a field researcher when you interact with especially smart people like the tropians. When I first played these games with pictures, with photographs, I show you how they look like in a minute, I just overheard that one of my consultants said, you know, you start with the first row, go to the right, go to the second row, go to the right. And then I said, oh, okay, good. Because I made the mistake that I put them all in the same order. Never did that again afterwards. But that shows you have to be extremely careful in data gathering. So we had, for example, these photo object games. They consisted of plastic toys and photos depicting spatial configurations of these toys. The director describes the photo and the performer or the matcher arranges the toys accordingly. Some of you may say, well, but you are on a South Sea island. As far as I know, with the exception probably of Tonga, there are no cows on a South Sea island. Yeah, there are no cows as we know them, but there are sea cows. And the Tropians used the word for sea cow, bulmachau, for the cow, and they were very happy with that. Okay, then we also had the wooden man game, where the director describes body poses and the matcher adjusts a wooden man. We had a Tinker Toy game. Actually, I was planning to do that, but this is really a bit unfair to many persons to play that, and I wouldn't have been able to check a Chinese game if people use Chinese, and I didn't dare to do that. We had 8 different constructions of these Tinker Toy things. We had things that were configurational and some that were non-configurational. The director had to describe the construction and the matcher had to rebuild it. Here we, in test stars, we had a very funny experience with Dutch students. They thought they were extremely smart and tried to use the system of pilots, you know, 12 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 6 o'clock, and 9 o'clock. After 20 minutes, they gave up, and within 5 minutes, they had it with just left and right representations. Then we had photo matching games. These were 4 series with twice 12 photos that were depicting certain localizations and configurations in 4 different directions on the horizontal plane. The photos were first shuffled and then laid out in front of the players. Then the director describes the photo and the matcher chooses the photo described. And these games provided us with a corpus of contextually anchored, complex interactive texts with many examples of spatial reference. And they were interactive because we always told the director as well as the matcher, especially the matcher, to ask questions if he or she didn't really get the description of the director. So we really got a whole lot of very, very interesting interactions with respect to spatial reference. And we did this with a whole lot of people in a whole lot of languages. Giovanni Bernardo worked on Tongan, Baldassar Bickel on Belhare, Penny Brown on Celtal, Yves Danziger on Mupan, James Ezekbi on Ewe, John Haviland on Boko-Yimithirr and on Tzotzil, Debbie Hill on Longo, Kyoko Inoue on Japanese, Elizabeth Keating on Konpein, Anna Marges on Saliba, Sota Okita on Japanese, Lourdes de Leon on Tzotzil, Paulette Levy on Totonac, Sabine Neumann on Kharahari, Eric Patterson on Tamil and Beto Kurumba, Eva Schulze-Band on Jaminchu and Nagili Guru, me on Kilivila, Hestel Stolz on Yucatec, Jörg Wassmann on Yukno, Thomas Whitlock on Hai Kon, that's a language I never can pronounce properly because I don't know the click loud. Thomas Kapta can do that. David Wirtins on Pante Arante, Roberto Zavala on Oluta Popoluca, and Steve Levinson on Boko-Yimithirr and on Celtal. Now, first analysis of these data revealed that we can find 3 major systems of frames of spatial reference. The first system is the so-called relative system, and these relative systems are viewpoint dependent. Localizations in space are derived from and described on the basis of the position and orientation of the speaker. In these systems, a sentence like "the ball is to the right of the man" is understood from the speaker's point of view only. That is, this reference completely neglects the orientation of the man. Intrinsic systems, on the other hand, utilize inherent, intrinsic features of an object to derive a projected region or to anchor the spatial reference to an object in these features. In these systems, a sentence like "the ball is to the man's right" is understood as follows. A man is an object with a front and back, a left and right side assigned to it. Thus, in intrinsic systems, this sentence refers to the position of the ball on the basis of the orientation of the man. The ball is at the right side of the man. The orientation of the speaker doesn't play any role whatsoever and is, within this system, of course, completely irrelevant for the understanding of this sentence. However, we want to note here that speakers using an intrinsic system for their spatial references also refer to the same configuration with the sentence we already mentioned above, namely, "the ball is to the right of the man." Thus, languages can be ambiguous with respect to whether they use an intrinsic or a relative perspective in their spatial references. Sentences, like the last one presented, can only be disambiguated in the actual situation and context. And finally, the third system are absolute systems. These systems operate on absolute concepts of direction, which may be linear or defined by quadrants. They are based on conventionalized directions or other fixed bearings that can be derived from meteorological, astronomical, or landscape features. And in these systems, and in our data, of course, we find sentences like, for example, "the ball is to the west of the man," "the ball is uphill from the man," "the ball is seawards to the man." Now, all three systems can be found in a given language, and they can be utilized for spatial references. However, many of the languages we have been studying so far frequently seem to prefer one frame of reference in a particular context. And because of these observations, we came up with the following hypothesis. If speakers of a language preferentially use one reference system in a particular spatial domain, then these speakers will rely on a comparable coding system for memorizing spatial configurations and for making inferences with respect to these spatial configurations in non-verbal problem solving. Now, to falsify or verify this hypothesis, we developed a number of experiments to test the interrelationship between space and cognition. The next step in our research had to explore, before we came up with these experiments, the cognitive implications of the three systems of verbal spatial reference. Relative, absolute, and intrinsic systems differ with respect to their dependence or independence with respect to the speaker's location and orientation. They are dependent in the relative system, but they are independent in the absolute and in the intrinsic system. Then, with respect to the rotation of the spatial configuration, they are dependent on the relative and in the absolute system, but independent in the intrinsic system. And with respect to the rotation of the crown, they are independent in the relative and in the absolute system, but dependent on the intrinsic system. Now, based on these differences of the three frames of spatial references, we developed 5 different non-verbal experiment-like tests that specifically explore the opposition between relative and absolute systems. These experiments for the investigation of non-verbal spatial cognition explore the nature of the spatial coding for memory and inference and make it possible to determine whether this non-verbal coding has certain specific properties. These properties can then be compared to the verbal codings elicited by the first kit to see whether there is a correlation between the verbal and the non-verbal system of spatial coding. Now, and in order to show you what we did, the kind of things, I have brought you these original things that were used on the Blueprint Islands for eliciting data of non-verbal problem solving. And now I need, for the second time, but for the last time in my talk, so we can come to the others without fear of being misused, I need another volunteer to do a little game with me. Who's coming? Yeah, men to the front.
You can do that.
It's not much, and actually you can't make a mistake. That is the great idea with that. That was something that we had to tell our consultants quite often, because they were afraid that they would make something wrong. And we said, no, whatever you do it in your way, and you do it right. And actually we were right. Can you please come on? Actually, I want to have here only one chair. I put these animals in a row up here. And can you come and have a look at them? Can you please memorize that? Can you keep that in mind?
Sure.
Okay?
Okay.
Fine?
Fine.
Okay. Well, I just want to tell you, I arrived yesterday evening from Germany via the Netherlands, and the weather was very strange, and it was raining, and I was terribly tired, so I was quite happy that I finally arrived. We did that in order to destroy eidetic memory. Could you please come with me? So, here are the animals. Please put them up the way you have seen them. Well, you did exactly follow my hypothesis. You see, in this side, the sheep was the first one, and it was on the left side. Then came the cow, and then came the horse. And he turned around 180 degrees. So he did that what I would have expected him to do, namely that he would work after a left and right system. So on this side, after he had turned around 180 degrees, the sheep had to be on the left side again, the cow in the middle, and the horse behind. Thank you very much. You did everything in the way I expected you to do. Okay, here you see the design again. I always have to be very careful when I present anything about these methods, not to show that picture before I actually do the task with the consultants. So it's quite clear we have two tables. On one table we have a stimulus in a certain orientation. This is north or south, or left and right. Then we take the stimulus away, have these 30 seconds where we destroy the eidetic memory, hopefully. But we had some very good psychologists who said that would do the job. Then we went to the other table, turned the person 180 degrees around, and asked him how he would put up the stimuli. And again, as I said, there are no possible mistakes. If you have an absolute system, you do not care at all if you turn around. What was looking north will be looking north again. And if you are a left-right person, like most of us are, you will just say, well, if the sheep was looking to the right and it was the first one, and then came the horse and the cow, or the cow and the horse, then you just do it in the same way so that the sheep is again in this direction. So we had the first one of these 5 series which we did was the animals in the row, which you have seen now with the excellent consultant performing. Then we had red and blue mazes. Here we tested the recall and the recognition memory. There was a maze lying on one table, and then we turned the consultant around again for 180 degrees, and the consultant had to choose which one of the red and blue mazes he had seen. And again, there is an absolute response and a relative response. Another thing was Eric's maze. Eric Pedersen developed that, and so we gave this test his name. This experiment tests recall and recognition memory with respect to movement in space and transformation of movement into the construction of a path. Then we had the Scout game, or Steve's Maze, because Steve was the one who came up with this idea. This experiment tests the ability to finish the incomplete path and recognition memory. And we had 5 different maps, and you had to find the one that finishes this path. You see, the path stops here in front of the forest, and you could take the relative response, or you could take the absolute response. And we finally, and this looks terribly complex, but we had no problem at all with our consultants to really carry this task out. It's a transitivity task. We had 3 objects. First, we showed on the first table the objects A and B in relation. Then we turned the person around, again with the 180 degrees, and showed him or her on the second table the relation of object C to object B. Then we came back to the first table and put up object A, and then asked the consultant where he or she would place object C. And again, there were 2 possible solutions. One was the relative one, and the other one was the absolute one. Now, what would we find out with respect to our hypothesis? Our first test showed that Arante, for example, preferred absolute frames of references, HICOM as well, Celtal and Longroom, and so we predicted that in the non-verbal project problem-solving solution we would find a similar result. In Dutch we had relative frames of references, in Japanese as well, and in Kilivila we had both intrinsic and relative, so we predicted relative. And in Bilhara we had absolute, in Tamil absolute, in Tamil that was spoken in the city we had a relative system, and in Khalahadi we had all 3 systems with a preference to the relative system, and in Mupan and in Totonac we had inherent systems, so we couldn't predict anything. And these are our results. The interesting thing was, which took me a long time to find out, that Kilivila uses, with respect to the orientation of the objects with each other, an absolute ad hoc system, a landmark system. For example, they say this object it looks at Pulya's house. Pulya is then one of the guys whose house is just there where you could see that this object is looking. So that was something that I only found out relatively late in my analysis of my data. But all in all, we were very happy with these outcomes. The relative, intrinsic, and absolute frames of reference can all be found and can be utilized for verbal spatial reference in a given language, as we had predicted. However, languages indeed seem to prefer certain frames of reference in particular contexts that ask for different spatial tasks and that may require different means and ends of spatial reference, like, for example, expressing the location of objects with respect to each other and or with respect to the space and the spatial configuration in which the speaker and the hearer are in relation to these objects and or expressing the orientation of these objects in space. Therefore, different means and tasks within the realm of spatial reference may evoke the preferred use of similarly different frames of reference in a given language. Thus, if speakers of a given language prefer a specific system of spatial reference in a specific spatial domain for a specific end with a specific function, then these speakers will use a similar codification system for memorizing spatial configurations and for solving other non-verbal problems in connection with such spatial configurations. And this is good evidence for the strong interrelationship between language, culture, and cognition. To sum up our results once more, it seems that languages indeed allow inferences to be made about the choice and the kind of conceptual parameters that speakers will use to solve certain non-verbal problems in the domain of space, about how they memorize certain spatial configurations, and about how they represent them in their long-term memory. Thus, these results support the hypothesis that languages contribute in shaping thinking for non-verbal problem-solving instances. However, even with these results of studies, like the one presented here, it remains somewhat problematic, at least to me, to argue that it is only language that influences thought in general. Although the research results show that speakers of specific languages have clear preferences for the frames of spatial reference in their verbal behavior, and that these preferences allow for predictions with respect to the speaker's behavior in non-verbal problem-solving tasks in the spatial domain, the following crucial facts should be taken into account. All speakers who prefer the absolute system can easily switch to forms of behavior that are based on a relative system of spatial reference if necessary. For example, when driving a car and expecting the right way of traffic rules. Otherwise, Australia would be a mess and we would have one car accident after the other. But Aborigines can thrive at least as good as Australians, white Australians. However, speakers that prefer a relative or intrinsic frame of spatial reference have severe difficulties in switching to an absolute system without using devices like a compass or a GPI system. I have a nice anecdote with respect to GPI systems that I can tell you in the question now. It's interesting to connect these observations with Dan Slovin's insight that the expression of experience in linguistic terms constitute thinking for speaking, a special form of thought that is mobilized for communication. Whatever effects grammar may or may not have outside of the act of speaking, the sort of mental activity that goes on while formulating utterances is not trivial or obvious and deserves our attention. We encounter the contents of the mind in a special way when they are being accessed for use. That is, the activity of thinking takes on a particular quality when it is employed in the activity of speaking. In the evanescent time frame of constructing utterances in discourse, one fits one's thought into available linguistic frames. Thinking for speaking involves picking those characteristics of objects and events that A, fit some conceptualization of the event, and B, are readily encodable in the language. Slovin also points out that languages we learn in childhood are not neutral coding systems of an objective reality. Rather, each one is a subjective orientation to the world of human experience, and this orientation affects the way in which we think while we are speaking. A similar idea to Slovin's concept of thinking for speaking seems to be the basis for Steven Pinker's criticism of Worf. Pinker states that Worf was surely wrong when he said that one's language determines how one conceptualizes reality in general. But he was probably correct in a much weaker sense. One's language does determine how one must conceptualize reality when one has to talk about it. And Lord Clark comments on Worf's hypothesis in his article Communities, Commonalities and Communication as follows. What Worf seems to take for granted that language is primarily an instrument of thought. Yet, this premise is false. Language is first and foremost an instrument of communication, the exchange of thoughts, as one dictionary puts it, and it is only derivatively an instrument of thought. If language has an influence on thought, as Worf believed, that influence must be mediated by the way language is used in communication. Clark continued, the alliteration in my title, Communication, Commonalities and Communication, is not accidental, for communication, as its Latin root suggests, is itself built on commonalities of thought between people, especially those taken for granted in the communities in which each language is used. Once this is made explicit, I suggest we will find it difficult to distinguish many potential influences of language on thought from the influences of other commonalities of mental life, especially the beliefs, practices and norms of the communities to which we belong. By pointing out that language is not primarily an instrument of thought and just one part of many other commonalities of mental life, Clark reduces the impact of even the weak version of the Worf hypothesis to a piece, albeit an important one, within the complex mosaic of the interrelationship between language, culture, and cognition. Consequently, Clark defines his position with respect to Wolff's doctrines as follows. There can be no human communication without commonalities of thought, but there can be commonalities of thought without communication. It should be evident by now that researching the relationship between language, culture, and cognition is a challenging but really rewarding enterprise. Boas and Zappi and other scholars like Malinowski insisted that the use of language must be studied in its social context. However, whoever wants to investigate the role of language, culture, and cognition in social interaction must know how the research society constructs its reality. Researchers need to be on common ground with the research communities, and this common ground knowledge is the prerequisite for any successful research within this domain. Thank you. Okay, any questions?
If we study language in the context of use, then how could we start doing it according to your experience?
Well, you just have to start by coming by interacting with people, and to be in the very beginning. You have, of course, learned the norms and the language of the language uses. Therefore, it takes a while, it takes a long time, and you make a lot of mistakes. And you sometimes feel like a bull in a china shop, because you, as a foreigner like me, in a culture like the Tropic Islanders, you are doomed to make terrible mistakes. Some of them are easily corrected, others of them, we will hear about some of these things in the next lectures, were really severe. But also always extremely enlightening, because I then realized what kind of things I still didn't know about Hilvina. And if you have these specific things in mind, like I tried to explain here with our research on spatial references, you just have to keep in mind that you want to know something about a specific domain. In order to do that, you have to develop, if you want to do it cross-linguistically, you have to develop some of these experiment-like methods where you can, to a relatively high degree, where you can be sure that the data that you collect are really comparable. And you have to create situations and contexts that are comparable. That was, for example, why I pointed out that all these instructions were standardized. You have to really abstract from some of the ideas. You have to document language as it's actually used in human interaction, as if a researcher is not there. It's the old observer paradox of William Labov. Well, you always find this observer paradox, and if you want to do these kind of psycholinguistic analyses, you have to give up some of the ideals of documenting language as it is. You have to elicit things, because some of these phenomena you are interested, or we were interested, are not easy to find in interaction. For example, one of the next bigger problems we had after the space project was a project on the language of the senses. And well, what will you do, for example, if you want to hear something about taste? You can't cook the people and give them things that are too much salted or whatever. You have to find exactly the same doses of tastes, and you have to ask people, could you please open your mouth, I spray something in, and you tell me what you taste. And this is in some cultures, it's a really tricky thing. I'm sure when I came back from the Tropic Islands, we lived in a village in Bavaria. It took me about, 2 or 3 days to make first contacts with the natives in Tauema, in the Tropical Islands. It took us 1.5 years in Daughter to make contacts with the Bavarians. So I always thought I could go to the Tropians, for example, and ask 12 people, 6 males, 6 females, I would like to know what you taste. Let's do it now. And open your mouth, and then say, oh, Sena Sumarenia. Oh, that's so sweet, Gunter. Like, it's so bad. You are such a bad man. It tastes so nastily. But you have to keep in mind that in these cultures, people still believe in black magic. And whatever you get sprayed into your mouth could be fatal. So you have to see what you can do and what you can't. But you need, in order to make these kind of comparisons, you need to have the standardized methods of data collecting, at least in these kinds of cognitive and psycholinguistic topics that we want to research. And the interesting thing is, if you do this cross-linguistically, then you really find the subjectivity you're after. You find the language specificity, or you find things that are culture-specific in these cultures. And that's what we are after. Yeah, please. Wait there.
Small question. I want to know if the language is possibly more mobile, the culture, because is it possible to recognize some kind of generational difference in the spatial recognition? Like for example, the 2 different generations of Chinese-speaking groups, but they use different spatial recognition systems. Like the older people prefer the absolute system, but the younger people prefer relative system. Is it possible to account for this phenomenon in the aspect of
Very nice question, because I have a great answer to it. I mentioned that Eric Pedersen was working on a village version and a city version of an Indian language. And he had one case where a villager who had just come to the city was playing our games with a man who had lived for a relatively long time in the village. And the villager who just had arrived wanted to do the farmer-like way, namely the absolute system. And the guy who lived in the city said, oh no. We are not in your country. We are here in the metropolis. You have to do it in this way. And he taught him how to use left and right. And then this guy was forced to use left and right. He made some mistakes, but was corrected. And this shows, for example, how social situations and new ways of living very rapidly actually change systems. And it shows also that if you do this kind of research, you have to be absolutely aware about the circumstances from which your consultants come from and where they live. So every good document, every good analysis of these kind of cognitive linguistic experiments has to keep in mind that they still compare X with X and not X with theirs. And only a good documentation of your methodological setting allows you to do that. And this also means that you know your consultants. In my case, for example, I had to know, and if I didn't know, I always asked, from which clan do you come? To which clan do you belong? Because I found out that the highest clans in the province, we have 4 clans, only the 2 highest clans have a political influence, the 2 lower clans have hardly any associated, or had only almost hardly any kind of societal influence that changed that, they are becoming missionaries. The upper clans, they have what we call sociolinguistic variables. And these sociolinguistic variables are marked. When they interact with each other, they can use special morphemes, for example, like classifiers, that people of the lower classes are not allowed to use. So you also have to be very aware of the fact with what kind of class or clan or hierarchy system you are working when you do your language comparisons. It's really a very complex system, and that is why I said you have to be on common ground with the people of your speech community, and it takes a while. Yeah? Can you give the microphone? Ah.
Thank you for this very inspiring talk. I was curious that you mentioned there could be an impact from the spatial task use. So I'm wondering that in your participants, you notice any difference and variation in how they select their spatial references in referential paradigm task versus the frog story? And is there any possible that impact from the shared knowledge? I mean, suppose the experimenters sit by the participant or across from each other.
Yeah, all the elicitation materials were of course very, very different. But we use that very broad approach in our methods in order to know as much as possible in a relatively opportunistic way. Because we also came up with a book on where we compared grammars of space within our languages. And of course, if you do not know anything about the use of acquisitions, for example, you can't come up with a good grammar because a very important part of spatial reference is neglected. The same is true with motion verbs, for example. And the frog story, I think, is a paradigmatic booklet to elicit acquisitions and motion verbs in a comparable way. Actually, it has become famous in psycholinguistics because Dan Slovin used it in his research on the acquisition of spatial reference in children. He has 4 big volumes edited. It's a very, very interesting piece of work. And on the other hand, these photo comparisons, for example, you had a describer and a matcher. There you saw a lot of very idiosyncratic behavior. Some people we had also some pictures that were just not relevant. For example, when we had these men standing side by side in different orientations, and suddenly we had 2 balls of different colors side by side. And of course they realized this was something that was not important, so they did it as first because that made space, and they could make the experiment in a faster way. Others were just following a strategy that they always looked at the man in these configurations that was looking at the observer. And so they used that series. But it was all very, very consistent, but very idiosyncratic. But the result was the same. Okay? Yeah?
Thank you very much, Professor Senft, for your interesting talk. I have a question. Of these 3 systems that you mentioned, namely the relative system, the intrinsic system, and the absolute systems, do you see any need of regarding any one of these systems to be at least theoretically more fundamental than the others? I ask this question because as you mentioned about Kant, I remember that he wrote an article called What is Orientation in Thinking? Was heißt sich im Denken orientieren? And it seems to me that Kant was of the opinion that the 4 geographical directions alone won't suffice for you to sufficiently or adequately four geographical directions to operate. You at least have to resort to the ability to differentiate between left and right, which has to do with the bodily schema. So that's my question.
Yeah, but well, we showed in a number of languages that this is not true. That Kant really was wrong. We had, well, I can tell you, these Guru-Yimide people, but also other people, for example, the Haikom in Botswana, they are really absolutely oriented. When Thomas Whitlock, for example, came to the Haikom and wanted to test them with respect to their orientation in space with GPS systems, they asked him, oh, do you want us to check whether they are functioning? That shows that they know what they are doing. But the other thing is, the Guru-Yimide, for example, they can even say that when you are pointing, you lie. When John Haviland came to them and said, look, I came from Cairns. Huh? It's not Cairns. Cairns is there. Or what was an extremely interesting phenomenon that we observed, which showed that these absolute systems are extremely important for the people, and that they obviously always seem to think about a right way of even making gestures, was the following. We had a man telling a story once to John Haviland, and 4 or 5 years later to Steve Levinson, and he told a story about how his boat capsized, and he just made it to get away from the sharks. So it was really an existential situation. At the first telling, the camera was there, and he was telling, and the boat capsized. The second telling, the camera was there, and he said, and the boat capsized. That is a very interesting thing that shows that people that are socialized in an environment that is extremely dangerous have to find a way to survive. And this one way to survive that they found was to be always absolutely oriented. They sometimes use dirty tricks. For example, when they go through the bush and they sleep at night, they always make their shade for wind and rain in a certain direction. So when they wake up, they are immediately oriented again. And otherwise, they make little fires, and the bush grass comes up with little clouds, and then they look back and they know exactly from where they come. But I do not know whether you ever were in the bush in Australia. I claim that I'm a very well-oriented person in our society. When I'm in the middle of the bush in Australia, close my eyes and turn 4 or 5 times around myself and then open my eyes, I'm lost. Simply lost. But they are not. And they learn this at a very early age. They even have games. For example, they play hide-and-seek games where children just verbally tell other children where they would find, for example, honeybee ants that they can eat. And they find them. And they learn this and are really convinced that they are always oriented. And they are. Does this answer your question?
Thank you very much for your lecture. Actually, it seems that there are many factors that influence orientation, not only language, like you just mentioned, some related to culture or to landscape or to some other factors. So I would like, my first question is, to which extent, or how can you measure the influence of language in non-verbal codification of space? And the second question is whether this is related to the fact that Kilibila was in the list of languages that of predictions and then of what you found, Kiribila was one of the languages in which the predictions weren't right. So could you perhaps explain what happened?
Let's first come to these various differentiations with respect to orientation and language. Our colleague Sotaro Kita checked how Americans and Japanese people described certain films, Tweety Bird and what's the name of that cat? I can't remember. And there was one scene. Sorry? Sylvester, yeah, thanks, great, yeah, Sylvester, I'm getting old, I lose the names of my title. And there was one scene where Sylvester wanted to swing from one skyscraper to another and grab the Tweety Bird who was sitting on the windowsill. Now, the Americans always said he swung over and tried to get a Tweety Bird. And they made this gesture. The Japanese said, one very, very creative person said, and he Tarzanized over, but he made this line. Because there is no word for swinging in Japan, in Japanese. And so here the inability to get lexical access to a proper word to describe exactly that action made the consultant very innovative, using a simile with Tarzan, but he kept constant with the idea that this was the orientation and the direction. Does it answer the first one to a certain extent? Yeah? Okay, good. The other one, Kiribila, was just a kind of, how should I say, I disregarded, to say it really harshly, I disregarded the role of an ad hoc landmark system in an absolute, as an absolute system. I always thought that, and he looks towards this place, or he's standing towards this place, that this was, well, just an additional way, but this was crucial for the Tropian Islanders' way of describing these configurations. They had they had a configuration with respect to the objects in the configuration, and then the other one was with respect to the objects towards each other. And the one was done in a relative frame of reference, and the other one was done in an ad hoc landmark system as an absolute frame of reference. And I really, it took me 3 or 4 years to find that out. Because I was too much biased, because I thought, well, I knew that contrary to many other Melanesian and especially Oceanic languages, the landscape seaside axis had no special importance for the Tropian Islanders, because they had all these others. But because I saw all these others, I didn't see the tree because of the forest. That happens.
Thank you very much for this very interesting talk. So I have a couple of questions. Maybe I hope that students can ask more questions. So I will try to be very brief. Related to what Hector just said. So this idea that this absolute system in a way seems to be pre-modern. It's like are there modern societies still using this system? Is it even possible in a modern, in a city? In a way, I think it's difficult.
Yeah.
And I don't believe that Japanese. This just came to my mind. Has no word for, what was it? The word?
To swing.
To swing. I don't believe this. So maybe he couldn't remember it in the moment.
Kita is a native speaker.
Yeah, but there's we have a lot of people who speak Japanese here. I mean, in Chinese you have a word, so I can't imagine that there's no word in Japanese. Yes.
But I can.
So it was weird, but I'm no specialist.
Yeah.
Just
No, I can only rely on Kita. But with respect to your other questions, of course, we have lots and lots of people who use absolute orientations. I once did that experiment here with animals in a row with a Dutchman.
Yeah.
And I was absolutely sure he would behave in the expected way. No, he was absolutely oriented. Then I asked him, what's your hobby? Sailing. Good guess. So people who necessarily use systems that are absolute, like pilots, like sailors, like scouts, they use these things in our society, but they are specialists. They are no longer, it's no longer something that you do because everyone does it and because it's necessary to survive in that society. You do it because it's necessary to survive on sea and to survive in air and to make the others that are flying with you also survive. But it's no longer something that the society requests from each of its members.
Thank you.
Maybe let me provide some information about your response to the Japanese case. Okay, as far if I remember right, in that paper, and actually Kita did a series of paper on the comparison between or non-Turkish English and including Japanese. So you're right, it's not that the Japanese language does not have a swing. Of course it does. The point is, it is not a habitual way to represent a motion event by using swing as the main verb. So they would use a motion verb like go instead. So that's the point. It's not that swing does not exist in the language, it does. But that is not a habitual way for the Japanese to represent a motion event, and that's the point.
That's what we're going to do. I forgot that. It's too long for me. Yeah?
I have a question about the task, the agreement between all these different tasks. Because for me, when I did the animals in a row game, I found that I'm really like the relative kind of reference system. But when I did this transitivity one, it turned into a transitive, the absolute kind of thing. So I'm just wondering whether there's some kind of agreement among all these different systems, all these different tasks, or just that I'm just a weird person, or I don't know if you encounter anything like this, that you actually found something interesting that is for one single subject, that actually responded differently toward different tasks.
Yeah, we had a few people who did it in a different way, but it was really remarkable that the majority of all our consultants were consistent. We had also some people who really came with very weird solutions for our animals in a row, and we couldn't count them. For example, we had them always in such a row that they are one behind the other. And suddenly someone put the cow across, and we had no idea why he or she did that. And she never saw it. And of course, you have to be aware of the fact that in the field you are not in a psychology lab. You cannot exclude a lot of variables and just center on one variable. Because you always have bystanders. And these bystanders comment. And you won't hear each of these comments. Because you are, of course, also involved in that interaction. And so you really have to take this as a kind of approach to do anthropological linguistics and cross-cultural psycholinguistic research in a dirty lab, if you like. You can't take these people into their own house and do something with them and exclude all the others. That would make you an impossible person, and actually they would think, what are they doing? Especially if you are a man and you have invited a girl to your house. This is absolutely a no-go. And And you can't do that. You have to also always be aware of the fact that if you're doing field research, you have to follow very specific ethical codes as a field researcher. For example, I was extremely happy that in 1983 my wife came with me for a year, because without her, who also learned the language, without her I wouldn't have any insights into female life on the province. And I would have ended up in a linguistic way of another Malinowski, who only described the society of the Tropic Islanders from the mesa. And these things come up to you, and you are confronted with them suddenly because you have a text where you ask for the meaning of a word. And it was a text where you wouldn't even thought that there could be any kind of negative things. If you asked what was going on there, it was one of these ditties, little verses that go with string figures. You know, where you have a string and you make various figures out of the string. And it was about a famous a midwife. And I was asking my young consultant who wanted to learn English from me, and I Kilila from him, and his father was with him, what does this word mean? He blushed, I don't know. I know. And he didn't blush when it has anything to do with pornographic details. These ditties are also full of pornographic details. But this was something with a midwife. And so he told me, ask this girl that is in my class at school, she will tell you. And then she came over, and it meant that she was able to even bring children to the world when there was a birth break. You know, when the child is not correctly in the birth chamber, and that she could turn the child into the birth chamber. But this is something that you, as a man, officially, are not allowed to know. So I brought him in a terrible moral dilemma. And these are things that you have to learn in some time, because things are different. They are different. And it took me always about 2 to 3 days to come into my Kilivila way of thinking and speaking. Which was fine, because I couldn't work in these first 2 or 3 days, because these were days for gossiping. I had to say everything what had happened in my family, because they knew my wife, they knew my children, and they had to tell me what was going on there. And once I was over the gossiping stage, I was back in Kilivila again. And believe me, my Kilivila is much better than my Dutch. Yeah. Benji.
So I have a silly question. So do people who speak do people who speak the language of the absolute system wear shoes? Like, if they do, how can they refer to one particular shoe? Like, I always have this problem when I was young. Like, I don't know which one is the left, which one is the right, and if they use only the absolute system, how can they refer to one particular shoe?
It's not at all a silly question. It's not at all a silly question. It's really a field researcher's question. Once they are on the foot, they can say it's my left shoe and it's my right shoe. But once they are 20 centimeters away, they say that is the shoe at the north.
So it depends on whether
it only gets relevant if you want to do something with it, and that means if you get it on your body.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. And you want to say that? Yeah.
And thank you, Professor. And this is a very informative lecture for me. And I'm just curious about that, whether being monolingual or multilingual would play a role in such a task that maybe it would affect that those people and their results of their conception of space. Possibly, for example, for people who owns language of Chinese and English, possibly his conception of space would be affected by English. Is that possible or something?
Yeah, of course. And you make then of course also mistakes because you mix up the systems. That's extremely interesting, and that is something you also have to check because that was the case in that Indian example I showed you. They had these two registers. One was the rural and the other was the urban register. And so the rural guy hadn't yet understood the urban system, the left and right system. So he had to learn it. But while he was learning, he was making mistakes. And I know that my colleagues, well, even John Haviland was never absolutely oriented to all these things, and he has better orientation than me. that is extremely difficult, and we have these absolute orientation systems also in very weird situations. We have, for example, absolute orientation systems in round islands, where you can always walk the same direction. The world is different if you go against against clockwise or anti-clockwise or clockwise. But then the language offers its speakers so many additional means to refer to special points on that island that you can very precisely define where you are. Where you first think, how the hell do they know where they are?
Thank you.
Yeah.
So,
hello. Following his question, I'm curious about if when we acquire the second language might affect the first language. I mean, there's some, empirical evidence that showing that sometimes when we acquire the second language may, in turn affect the first language. What about if we learn the second language? Might that, influence our, way of talking about our, linguistic space?
I answer the question with a very, very personal and family observation. When I had a hard day in Nijmegen, I came back home and sometimes I addressed my wife in Dutch or I addressed my daughter in English. And my daughter really made a lot of fun of me. And then she went to Nijmegen and studied there and lived there. When she came back and she had a hard day, the same happened with her. She addressed me in Dutch and I made fun of her. So of course, the way of how we acquire languages influences us in a very incredible with a very incredible amount, I'd say. And again, this is introspection. Up till February, my main language during the day was English and sometimes Dutch. And now that I'm retired, I sometimes have really word-finding problems for the correct German word. And I realized that my professional life has to a certain degree alienated me from my mother tongue. Because I hardly ever published anything on Kilivila, and most things I published were on Kilivila, in German, because if you only publish it in German, it's useless. The Germans are not the addressees of these kind of papers. The addressees are in the Pacific. That means New Zealand, Australia, and all the countries in Melanesia, Polynesia, and Micronesia, but not in Germany and not in a little town in the lower left Rhine. So we should not underestimate the impact of second and third languages that we learn in our monolingual societies. And I would like to make this difference, because quite often people in Papua New Guinea ask me, how many languages do you speak? You are a linguist. Well, local dialect, German, English, my Latin is still quite good. I can, with the help of Latin, do something with French, but I can't speak French. I can speak Kilivila, of course, as you know, but I only can also read Tokpis. But only 4 that you really fluently speak. I speak 8. And they do. And they do, because they have this incredible amount of languages that are surrounding them. As I said, it's 873 at the last count. And these are languages, they are not dialects. These languages also are differentiated into dialects. Kilivila, for example, has at least 4 dialects. Others claim that they have 7. And the differences between these languages are as strong as, for example, between German and Hungarian. There are different language families. And with respect to the Papuan languages, there was a time where we were not even sure whether they have a real ancestor. We come up with very new methods, mathematical and statistical methods, that we can verify some of the hypotheses by people like Stephen Worm also about the Trans-New Guinea language family. They up till 4 or 5 years, they only spoke of the Trans-New Guinea language phylum. Now they say it's a family, because there is evidence there. But it's so difficult to find that out that you see in this incredible multilingual society, you are forced, for example, if you want to have a mate, if you want to marry a woman, you know, in my society, well, let's say I'm a Malasi. I only have one who is not from my clan, and I don't like her. No. But where do I find someone who is also in my clan system? 200 sea miles away, there is a nice little island. The last time I was there, was that beautiful girl. And then you inquire, what clan is she? Oh, that would fit. So, in order to woo her, you have to learn the language. Well, and that's one of the biggest motivations to learn a language, at least for a man, as we all know. Okay?
I have a question about slogans thinking for speaking. Do you think that is a very good alternative to Sapir Whorf hypothesis? And you nodded, okay. Yeah. I think many cognitive scientists are very interested in this, in slogans thinking for speaking. But I didn't find too much evidence to support it actually. But it seems it just provided a very good example, a good piece of evidence to support it. That is, you mentioned that about the shoe example, okay? From your shoe example. And then, so you said, okay, in the language, in one situation, in one communicative situation about wearing shoes, okay, so the relative system is used, but if the shoes are some distance away, then the absolute system is used. So that seems to be a very good piece of evidence to me that supports thinking for speaking. What do you think?
Yeah. Well, I think Dan Slocum and some others like her Clark, and also I think the members of our group, were not always aware of the fact that the basic thing that goes with language is to have a bonding function. We live in a society where we have to make friends with others, and where we have to come up with a group, and where we also, unfortunately, have to differentiate this in-group from an out-group. That goes with it, you have to buy them. But the main thing is that language is first of all a tool for coming up with a social treaty. And if you just think what kind of things we say to each other over a day, there is sometimes in specific situations something where you really have insights and think and food for thought. But when you speak, you develop a different way of thinking. I'm sure that a mathematician or a statistician doesn't use verbal means first and foremost in order to solve a problem. These are different ways of thinking. And I think the bias we had a long, long time in linguistics, also probably based on Chomsky's ideas about language and mind, was that it's only there in order to communicate thoughts. No, we communicate feelings, we communicate sympathies, we communicate emotions, and we communicate wishes to live together in a decent way. That is the main function, I think. It's bonding, like Malinowski said, emphatic communion. And he didn't say communication. It's often cited as emphatic communication. It's emphatic communion. He came up with that Catholic idea of communion. He was a Catholic, a Polish Catholic. It's something to construct a society where people feel that they belong to each other and that they can trust in each other. And I think this is what then pointed out. We always thought that thinking is only reserved for speaking. No, not at all. We think in a lot of different ways, and it's probably a linguistic hypocrisy to say we only use thinking for speaking. But the days are over that we can use that as a legitimation for our discipline. That's my conviction. Sorry.
Yeah, it's a very interesting topic here. I would like to ask a follow-up question. So, this idea that when we do not speak, when we are thinking, as you just said, then there is, as Slovians says there in this excerpt, that there is mental activity going on. So philosophers have, for a long time, hold the belief that there is some sort of a pure thinking, like Aristotle. There is pure thinking happening in the mind, and in the second step, people are translating thinking into words.
Yeah.
So there's this difference, traditional theory of language. There's a difference between pure thinking and thinking in words. But later on, we had Wittgenstein, and somehow he destroyed or he deconstructed this idea.
Yeah.
So it's not easy to understand what would be mental activity without words. So beyond language. So is there like empirical research? Has people done empirical research on this, or what would this be? Like mental activity which is not happening in words. Or like what would this be? And you just mentioned mathematicians. They maybe think in formula. But this is the case. But normal people, what would be mental? I don't really understand this point. What would be mental activity that's not going on in words? What is not expressing itself in words? So like in images or like feelings. Or what would this be?
Look at emotional research, for example. When you are confronted with certain situations, your body reacts in a certain way. You have these classical responses that you either attack or you flee. Is this done verbally, or is doesn't it show in the whole way of your body configuration, your tenseness of muscles, your sweat on your hands, that something is going on that has nothing to do with words?
So, but this is not mental activity, no? This is kind of a bodily reaction.
Well, why not? Isn't it also guided by mental activities that are but probably that is one of the places where something that I do not very much like can give an answer, namely fMRI studies. Where you then see in the blood activity in the brain that something is going on. And that something can be even similar to things that you see when people are asked to speak.
Yeah.
But obviously this is not the same thing
Yeah.
in a certain situation. Maybe this can give us an answer to that question. I think it's an excellent question, but I'm convinced that that Wittgenstein here was wrong.
Yeah.
I'm really sorry, but
No,
I liked him very much, but he's not right in everything. Yeah.
Another follow-up question then, because in all these experiments you kind of demonstrate the relationship between language and thinking, but to what extent is language influencing thinking, and to what extent is the opposite going on?
That is the $100 question. I can answer it. And I'm arguing against my boss. Steve said, we have shown that language influences thinking. I think we haven't shown it at all. But we could live together with these, with these different approaches. I don't know of any study that makes a clear causal connection between what is influencing what. We know that there is interaction. I would always say there is a close interaction between language, culture, and cognition. And I would also like to include culture. It's a very important one, because culture gives all the norms and all the frames that we use for speaking. But I would never ever dare to say we have clearly shown that language influences thinking. That's why I came up with the final. We saw that there's a great relationship between language, culture, and cognition. And I wouldn't dare to say anything more, at least not on the basis of our present knowledge.
Yeah, we are almost running out of time. So this is very interesting. Maybe we can take one or two more questions.
Yeah.
And we have prepared. I forgot the tea break. We were supposed to have tea and.
Okay. Sorry.
So I forgot this. So
but we can have it afterwards.
the tea is still waiting for us, so we can We can either continue this over tea and coffee, or we can maybe have one or two more final questions for Professor Senft. Yeah. Are there any more comments, or anybody who wants to challenge or Professor Senft? No. So then let's maybe stop here, and we have more lectures. So we really thank you. We are very thankful to Professor Senft, and maybe let's give him one warm hand, and then we have coffee. Thank you.
Don't worry, I won't have any volunteers necessary.
Yeah, see you again on Monday. The next lecture is on Monday.
Thank you for sharing.